In 1979, the Soviet Union upgraded its own T-72 tanks with a new turret, a composite armor package that added roughly 100 millimeters of protection against a shaped charge warhead. It did not upgrade the T-72 tanks it was selling abroad. Iraq owned hundreds of T-72 tanks by 1990, bought and paid for, real tanks in real service. Every one of them still built to the older plain steel specification the Soviet Union had already moved past at home 9 years earlier. Nobody selling those tanks to Baghdad ever mentioned that. In February 1991, when American and British gunners started killing Iraqi T-72 tanks at ranges the tank's own gun could not answer, and then found the turrets sitting meters away from the hulls they had been welded to, they were not disproving the T-72's fearsome reputation. They were fighting the specific, cheaper-built version of it that Moscow had decided 12 years earlier its own paying customers did not need to have. Consider that for a moment. One tank, sold under one name, quietly built to 2 different levels of protection depending on who was buying it, and almost nobody outside Soviet procurement offices knew that going in. The tank at the center of that gap did not begin as a fresh design. It began because one Soviet design bureau had just lost a competition and needed something of its own left to build. In the mid-1960s, 2 Soviet design bureaus had competed head-to-head to replace the aging T-55. Alexander Morozov's team at the Kharkiv-Morozov Machine Building Design Bureau, and Leonid Kartsev's OKB 520 at Uralvagonzavod in Nizhny Tagil. Kartsev was no newcomer to the job. He had led that bureau since 1953, fitted the T-54 with its first gun stabilizer, folded years of incremental T-54 upgrades into what became the T-55 in 1958, and gone on to design the T-62 and the IT-1 missile tank destroyer, all before this rivalry ever began. Morozov's radical compact design, Object 434, 1, entering service as the T-64, which left Kartsev's own bureau in the position of manufacturing a rival's tank at its own factory, an arrangement Uralvagonzavod had no interest in tolerating any longer than it had to. In 1967, Kartsev's team began reworking the T-64 concept into something Uralvagonzavod could build and sell as its own, a simpler, more reliable engine derived from the older V2 lineage in place of the T-64's troublesome 5T-DF, and a less exotic autoloader than the T-64's own problem-plagued system, trading some of Morozov's ambition for a tank Soviet industry could actually build in the numbers a real war would require, under a bureau that finally had a design of its own to build again. The rivalry did not stop at 2. A third bureau at the Leningrad Kirov plant was simultaneously developing its own answer to the same requirement, a higher-tech, gas turbine-powered design that would enter service as the T-80. All 3 tanks, the T-64, the T-72, and the T-80, existed to meet the identical operational requirement, break through a NATO defensive line in Central Europe, and all 3 stayed in production and in parallel frontline service for most of the Cold War's remaining decades, an arrangement driven less by any of the 3 tanks' actual merits than by the simple fact that each design bureau had its own patrons in the Politburo and its own factory floor of workers who needed something to build. Total production of the T-72 and its direct derivatives alone eventually reached roughly 25,000 units built across the Soviet Union, and, under license, well beyond it, making it one of the most numerous tanks ever built. And Uralvagonzavod never had to hand its own factory over to somebody else's design again. The first prototype, carrying a T-72 turret, a new 125mm D-81 gun, and a V-45 engine, was completed in January 1968 and trialed at the Kubinka Proving Ground that same year, and in Central Asia the next. After head-to-head comparative testing against the T-64A turned up problems significant enough to send the design back to the drawing board, Kartsev's deputy, Valery Venediktov, took over refining it, and a re-engineered version went through further trials in Transbaikal in 1971. A Council of Ministers decree on January 1, 1972, cleared the way for production, freeing Uralvagonzavod from having to build the T-64A at all, and a final trial batch, designated Object 172M, was tested through 1973. On August 7, 1973, the Central Committee and the Council of Ministers formally adopted it into Soviet service under the name T-72 Ural. From its very first year in service, the T-72 was conceived as the tank the Soviet Union could afford to build in bulk, and, unlike the T-64, the tank it could afford to let leave the country. That second half of the design brief is the half almost nobody talks about, and it is the half that everything else in this story comes back to. Western intelligence could not even reliably tell the T-64 and the T-72 apart at first, let alone sort out which version of either one it was actually looking at. In September and October 1976, British and American analysts watched a new Soviet tank type being issued in large numbers to the group of Soviet forces Germany, and, working from earlier, partial intelligence about a tank called the T-72, assumed that was what they were seeing. A second, similar-looking tank spotted near Moscow around the same time got labeled Moscow T-72 to distinguish it. It took further data before analysts worked out that the tank issued in East Germany was actually the T-64, and the one they had provisionally called Moscow T-72 was in fact the real T-72. The two told apart in the end, mainly by the road wheels, small stamped steel wheels on the T-64 against larger die-cast wheels with 3 return rollers on the T-72. If NATO's own analysts needed the better part of a year just to work out which of 2 entirely different Soviet tanks they were looking at, the far subtler question of which specific T-72 a given customer had actually received was never going to answer itself. What actually separated one T-72 from another, mechanically, was a single component: the composite package inside the turret's front, and whether a given production run got one at all. The earliest T-72 Ural, in both Soviet and export hands alike, carried a monolithic steel turret with no composite layer whatsoever, protection that had already been judged adequate against contemporary NATO anti-tank rounds, but nothing more. That changed for the Soviet Union's own tank crews in 1979, when the T-72A entered service carrying a genuinely new turret front. 3 layers, steel on the outside and inside, with a filler of sand or ceramic rods sandwiched between them, a design NATO analysts nicknamed Dolly Parton for the pronounced bulge it gave the turret's front corners. That composite package raised the turret's effective protection against shaped charge warheads from roughly 400 millimeters to roughly 500 millimeters of rolled homogeneous armor equivalent. a jump of about 100 millimeters that meant the difference between a hit that penetrated and one that did not. Poland and Czechoslovakia, both licensed by Moscow to build and export their own T-72s starting in 1978, were given the plans for the earlier steel-only Ural standard turret to build as the T-72M, a version with, as later Western assessments bluntly put it, no direct equivalent anywhere in the Soviet Army's own inventory. The tank Warsaw Pact factories were licensed to export was, by the time it left the factory floor, already a full design generation behind what Soviet units parked a few hundred kilometers away were driving. A later export upgrade, the T-72M1, finally added a version of the T-72A's own composite turret starting in the early 1980s, along with an extra 16mm steel plate bolted onto the upper hull glacis, closing most of the gap, though Western technical assessments still credited the genuine Soviet-issue T-72A with a slightly thicker composite package than even the upgraded export standard carried. Layered on top of all of that sat a second, older design choice nobody had reason to scrutinize until it mattered. The T-72's autoloader stored its ready ammunition in a carousel running around the turret ring, directly beneath the crew, with no blast door separating it from the fighting compartment. The arrangement let Soviet engineers build a lower, smaller turret with a three-man crew instead of four. Exactly the kind of efficient trade the T-72's whole design brief was built around. It also meant that any penetrating hit reaching that carousel had a clear, unobstructed path to dozens of ready propellant charges at once. The two-tier system did not stop at armor either. Base model export tanks lacked a laser rangefinder entirely for years, relying instead on an older optical coincidence rangefinder, the TPD-249, and only started receiving lasers around 1985, and often only on the specific vehicles assigned to platoon and squadron commanders, rather than across the whole unit. Even the improved T-72M1's fire control remained a largely manual affair by comparison. A gunner read the range off his sight and then had to dial it, along with separately estimated ballistic and weather corrections, into an analog computer by hand before firing a slower and more error-prone process than whatever equivalent automation Soviet-issue tanks carried for their own crews. Even the ammunition loaded into that carousel was not the same ammunition. The armor-piercing rounds manufactured specifically for export, designated 3BM-17 and 3BM-18, were built with roughly half the penetration at 2,000 meters of the equivalent round the Soviet Union, kept for its own tank regiments, meaning an export T-72 was quietly weaker in exactly the category, gun performance, that its 125mm main armament was supposed to be its single strongest selling point. American designers solved the same underlying problem, where to put a tank's ready ammunition in the opposite direction entirely. The M1 Abrams stores its main gun rounds in a separate compartment at the rear of the turret, sealed off from the crew by a powered armored door, and topped with blowout panels engineered to vent an internal explosion upward and outward, rather than into the fighting compartment. Soviet designers accepted the reverse trade, a faster loading cycle and a smaller crew, bought at the cost of parking dozens of live propellant charges in the one place a penetrating hit was likeliest to find them. None of this exporting happened out of generosity. By 1980, the The Soviet Union was the world's largest arms exporter, responsible for roughly a third of all global arms sales. And tanks sold abroad were bringing in hard currency. Moscow badly needed to cover chronic shortfalls in grain and technology imports. Income, some estimates put at 5 to 10% of all Soviet hard currency earnings through the 1980s. The Kremlin needed the revenue enough to sell the T-72 by the thousand, and needed its own military edge intact enough that it was never willing to sell the whole tank to get it. Doctrine dictated exactly who received which version, and the pattern makes the two-tier system impossible to read as an accident. Poland and Czechoslovakia built the steel-turreted T-72M and, later, the composite-equipped T-72M1, not just for outside customers, but for their own fellow Warsaw Pact members. East Germany alone received 549 of them, Hungary took 138, and Bulgaria 334, each one built to the export standard, rather than the standard the Soviet Union's own frontline divisions were already fielding. Iraq, Syria, and Libya received the same downgraded tanks through the 1980s, without ever being told they were buying anything less than what Soviet crews themselves carried. Iraq's T-72M tanks saw real combat during the Iran-Iraq War, most decisively in the Second Battle of Al-Fao in April 1988, when a newly reorganized Iraqi force, built around more than 100,000 Republican Guard troops, opened with a saturation artillery barrage, and then sent some 150 tanks forward behind it, retaking the entire peninsula from a far smaller Iranian garrison within about a day. And the fleet of roughly 1,000 T-72 tanks Iraq brought into Kuwait in 1990, of which only some 200 to 300 were still estimated to exist afterward, was built on that same export standard lineage. Syria's own export standard T-72 tanks had already gone to war once before against Israel in the Bekaa Valley in June 1982, with a combat record that neither side has ever agreed on. Israel credited its Merkava tanks with destroying 9 T-72 tanks for no losses of its own, while Syrian accounts and independent defense analysts dispute that figure outright and note that a Syrian armored division's T-72 tanks halted and briefly pushed back an advancing Israeli brigade near Rashaya on June 10th of that year, a genuine tactical result that undercuts any claim that the export standard tank was simply worthless in the hands that actually owned it. When the ground war opened in February 1991, American M1A1 Abrams tanks and British Challenger 1 tanks engaged Iraqi T-72 tanks at ranges well beyond the T-72 tank's own effective gun range. Most famously, during the Battle of 73 Easting on February the 26th, 1991, when the 2nd Armored Cavalry Regiment, a reconnaissance and security force, roughly 4,500 strong, engaged dug-in Republican Guard and Tawakalna Division armor, and accounted for some 160 Iraqi tanks and hundreds of other vehicles that day, for a cost of 6 Americans killed, 19 wounded, and a single Bradley fighting vehicle lost, with no Abrams tanks lost to enemy fire at all. And separately, when a British Challenger 1 destroyed a T-72 tank at a range of over 5,100 meters, the longest confirmed tank versus tank kill on record. That is not, on its own, evidence that the T-72, as a design, was worthless. It is evidence that the specific T-72 tanks Iraq owned were the export tier, fighting without the roughly 100 millimeters of composite protection Soviet doctrine reserved for its own crews. What coalition forces found afterward made the second design flaw impossible to ignore. Rows of destroyed Iraqi T-72 tanks, with their turrets sitting meters away from the hulls they had been welded to. The carousel autoloaders exposed ammunition, having detonated in a chain reaction violent enough to blow the turret clean off, an effect crews came to call the jack-in-the-box. It is worth being precise about what the record actually says, rather than the version that circulated afterward. One M1A1 tank was put out of action by Iraqi fire during the war, and 6 others were struck by 125mm rounds without being disabled, not the flawless record of 0 losses, often repeated since. The T-72 tank that lost that war so lopsidedly was never the tank the Soviet Union built for itself. It was the tank Moscow had decided years earlier that Iraq did not need to have. That decision reached further than the desert customers most retellings focus on. And that is the piece of this story an audience raised on Gulf War footage almost never hears. The assumption baked into most accounts is that the downgrade was a courtesy extended to distant, less trusted clients: Iraq, Syria, Libya, nations the Soviet Union armed but never fully vouched for. The actual distribution pattern says otherwise. East Germany, Hungary, and Bulgaria were not distant clients. They were treaty allies inside the Warsaw Pact itself, bound to the same mutual defense structure the Soviet Union was. And every one of the hundreds of T-72s each received still came off a Polish or Czechoslovak line building to the export specification rather than the standard issued to Soviet divisions. Finland, which was in the Warsaw Pact's orbit in neither name nor treaty, actually did better. Roughly 70 T-72 M1s sold directly between 1984 and 1990 carried composite armor from the start. India, buying both directly and under its own license to build roughly 1,000 T-72 M1s domestically at its Avadi facility, ended up fielding a tank closer to the Soviet Union's own domestic armor standard than most of the USSR's own treaty partners ever received. Yugoslavia, a communist state that belonged to neither NATO nor the Warsaw Pact, went further still. Rather than simply accept Moscow's export terms, Yugoslav engineers redesigned the licensed T-72 with their own fire control system, their own electronics, and a 1,000 horsepower engine in place of the original's 780, producing a distinct tank, the M84, that entered service in 1984, arguably better equipped than the version most actual Warsaw Pact members were driving. That distribution pattern complicates the standard version of this story, not just the popular Gulf War myth. The term monkey model itself was popularized in the West by Viktor Suvorov, a Soviet military intelligence defector, in his book Inside the Soviet Army, and the account that spread from it held that the practice was aimed at non-communist clients, specifically Egypt, Iraq, and Syria, while the Warsaw Pact's own communist allies could be trusted with the genuine, fully capable version. The T-72's own paper trail does not support that version of the rule. East Germany, Hungary, and Bulgaria were about as communist and as thoroughly inside the Warsaw Pact as a country could be, and every one of them still received the export standard tank built in Poland or Czechoslovakia, rather than the tank Soviet units themselves drove. Even inside that export tier, there was a further split nobody advertised. The version built for Warsaw Pact buyers, factory-designated Object 172M1E5, and the version built for everyone else, including India and Iraq, designated Object 172M1E6, were otherwise identical machines, whose only documented difference was the nuclear, biological, and chemical protection package, the lining that shields a crew from radiation and contamination, fitted to one and not the other. Genuine Soviet-issued tanks carried an NBC lining woven from a boron compound specifically meant to reduce neutron penetration from a tactical nuclear detonation. Most export customers, Warsaw Pact and otherwise, got some version of the tank built to fight the war Moscow actually expected, with a survivability feature quietly withheld depending on exactly which buyer was asking. The downgrade, in other words, was never really about distance or distrust of a particular regime. It was a standing, permanent manufacturing policy, and the closest thing to a rule it followed was that nobody outside the Soviet Union's own army got the complete tank, allies included. That policy outlasted the country that invented it. The first export T-72, genuinely built to match the Soviet Union's own late-model domestic standard, the T-72S, with a reactive armor package comparable to what Soviet forces carried, did not reach the market until 2001, a full decade after the Soviet Union itself had ceased to exist. For the entire lifespan of the two-tier system, every single customer outside the Soviet armed forces bought a tank that was, by design, not the real one. None of the genuine, full specification lineage disappeared, and neither did the tanks that exposed the gap between it and everything sold under the same name. The original Object 172 and Object 172M prototypes, the actual machines Kartsev and Venediktov built and refined between 1968 and 1973, sit today preserved side by side in an outdoor military museum collection in Russia at Kubinka, outside Moscow. The two machines that started this whole story parked next to each other, roughly 1,000 kilometers away, and an ocean beyond that, a captured Iraqi T-72, taken from an Iraqi Republican Guard armored unit in 1991 by 1st Battalion, 37th Armor Regiment of the U.S. Army's 1st Infantry Division, was shipped home to the United States in 1992, and today sits in a military museum collection in Georgia. A single export standard hull, standing in for every tank that fought and lost under a name it never fully earned. Another Gulf War Iraqi T-72 sits in a military museum collection in England, at Bovington. A short walk from the Cold War-era Soviet armor, it was built to imitate, rather than the equal that name always implied. Both machines still say T-72 on the hull. Only one of them ever carried the roughly 100 millimeters of protection that name was supposed to guarantee, and only one of them was ever built to be what that name was supposed to mean.